CIA was in bed with the cartels down there and training contras in
The sirens in Laredo cut through the midnight wind like a warning from another world. Helicopters circled low. Dust swallowed the Texas plains as armored DHS convoys stormed an unmarked ranch. Within minutes, gunfire erupted sharp, mechanical, relentless. By dawn, 2 of El Chapo's sons lay dead. The empire that once ruled the hemisphere's drug routes was in flames. But what if this wasn't just a cartel raid? What if Washington had stumbled onto something far deeper, an unholy pact between the ghosts of intelligence wars and the lords of narcotics? Officials confirmed what many had feared. The Department of Homeland Security had uncovered a hidden Sinaloa command bunker just outside Laredo. Inside, agents found not only narcotics and weapons, but servers, encrypted communication lines, and ledgers mapping trade routes stretching from Houston to Chicago. Intelligence sources cited by Reuters described it as a mirror of military-grade logistics, suggesting the cartel's U.S. footprint was far larger than previously believed. The operation, codenamed Silent Cross, had been in motion for months, tracking shipments disguised as oil logistics from Texas into northern Mexico. Yet what stunned analysts wasn't the scale of the trafficking, it was the sophistication. BBC reported the site included digital infrastructure on par with defense networks, and DW noted the presence of encryption technology traced to a European subcontractor once tied to NATO's cybersecurity programs. Moments before the raid, satellites caught a private jet lifting off its transponder, briefly blinking above the Rio Grande before vanishing. Intelligence later identified one of its passengers as Ismael El Mayo Zambada, the ghostly mentor who had evaded capture for over 50 years. Accompanying him was Joaquin Guzman, Lopez El Chapo's surviving son. The theory soon took hold that what unfolded in Texas wasn't just a drug bust, but a collapsed negotiation and exchange gone wrong between cartel envoys and covert American intermediaries. The Guardian later reported that Ovidio Guzman, another of El Chapo's sons, had been in communication with DHS contacts allegedly offering intelligence about political figures in exchange for immunity, but someone leaked. Within hours, the ranch turned into a battlefield, leaving the US-Mexico border choking on fire and speculation. The shock rippled beyond narcotics enforcement. Defense analysts from Janes compared the aftermath to a hybrid warfare incident, part counterterrorism strike, part intelligence purge. This wasn't about drugs, one source claimed. It was about control of information. In the global context, the Texas raid mirrored the blurred front lines of today's conflicts. Ukraine's cyber networks under siege, Israel and Iran clashing through drones and proxies China, and the US waging economic and digital shadow wars. Each battle redefined sovereignty, just as Sinaloa's digital empire had redefined criminal geography. For the people of Laredo, though, it wasn't geopolitics, it was terror. Families hid in cellars as tracer rounds lit up the desert night. Schools shut down. Border crossings froze. What began as an anti-cartel raid now felt like a domestic war zone. And in Washington, where President Donald Trump vowed to eradicate every narco fortress north of the border, one question lingered. If America's enemies have already learned to hide inside its own systems, how much of the homeland is still truly under its control? The image of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman collapsing in his Colorado prison cell spread faster than the smoke over Laredo. Guards said he repeated the same words again and again. They took my bloodline. For the first time in decades, the man who once commanded fear across continents looked broken. But behind his breakdown lay something far greater than grief. It was the end of an empire and the unmasking of a myth. From the Supermax corridors of ADX Florence, El Chapo had watched his world burn in silence. 2 sons dead, his mentor missing, and a network collapsing into civil war. Analysts from Reuters confirmed that the Department of Homeland Security's raid had triggered the largest intercartel conflict since 2011. Over 200 civilians were displaced in the first 24 hours, and 3 police convoys ambushed in retaliation. The once untouchable Sinaloa syndicate was tearing itself apart. To understand his collapse, one must understand his place in the machine. El Chapo was never the true king, merely the face. The mind behind Sinaloa's global empire had always been El Mayo Zambada, the invisible architect who kept one step ahead of death law and loyalty. BBC News described him as the last untouchable man in organized crime. So when reports surfaced that El Mayo had either been captured or had fled under US protection, Mexico's underworld imploded. The betrayal came swiftly. Intelligence gathered by Al Jazeera showed that internal cartel communications used the code phrase "La sangre fue pagada," the blood was paid. Bodies of senior lieutenants appeared across Culiacan and Juarez. Cartel networks once united under the Guzman bloodline fractured into tribal militias. Even the Mexican army hesitated to intervene, fearing that any movement might ignite a full-scale insurgency. The political fallout crossed borders. Mexican officials denied involvement, insisting that the Laredo raid was a unilateral U.S. incursion. DW reported growing outrage in Mexico City, where lawmakers accused Washington of violating bilateral security treaties. Yet President Donald Trump doubled down, declaring that no line, no border, and no corrupt politician will protect America's enemies. But beneath the patriotic rhetoric, intelligence insiders whispered another truth, that the operation may have uncovered evidence of U.S. complicity dating back decades. The seized digital archives mentioned Operation White Tower, a name long associated with Cold War-era CIA narcotics channels. If authentic, it meant that Sinaloa's foundations had been built on the same covert architecture once used to fund anti-communist campaigns in Latin America. In effect, the empire El Chapo thought he ruled might have been designed by his supposed enemies all along. That realization that he was never the architect but the pawn crushed him. For decades, he had played the role of the folk hero, the Robin Hood of Sinaloa, feeding villages, building schools, buying silence with generosity. But now his legend was ashes. The myth had become a mask for geopolitical convenience. The collapse of Sinaloa's hierarchy echoed another pattern seen worldwide. In Ukraine, cyber wars and misinformation blur the boundary between battlefield and bureaucracy. In the Israel-Iran conflict, shadow alliances and deniable operations mirror the duality of cartel diplomacy. And in the economic struggle between Washington and Beijing, control of data, not territory, determines who truly holds power. The same invisible wars now waged across nations were once pioneered in the deserts of Mexico. Meanwhile, for ordinary citizens trapped between armies and cartels, life became a game of survival. Border towns transformed into ghost cities. Truckers abandoned highways. In Culiacan, parents forbade children from walking to school. Fear replaced government. So as the US celebrated another counter-narcotics victory, the question remained, how much victory can a nation claim when its enemies were born from the shadows it once created? The excavation team thought the raid was over. Then they found the vault. Hidden beneath reinforced concrete and lead shielding, it was sealed by biometric locks and protected like a nuclear archive. Inside lay boxes of printed ledgers, hard drives, and handwritten letters between cartel bosses and men posing as consultants for American defense contractors. That discovery changed everything. Federal agents quickly realized they had stumbled into something far beyond the scope of narcotics enforcement. According to Reuters and The Guardian, the documents referenced a defunct program codenamed Project Halcon, a supposed counter-narcotics initiative from the Bush era that intelligence experts now suspect was used as a front for weapons transfers to Latin America. The implication was staggering. U.S. defense firms, through intermediaries, may have supplied military-grade equipment that later appeared in cartel arsenals across Mexico. Inside one envelope, agents found a note marked MZ, believed to be the initials of Ismael El Mayo Zambada, approving a shipment of encrypted radios for agricultural field operations. But as Defense News confirmed, the model listed matched communication systems used by NATO's own reconnaissance units in Eastern Europe. The overlap was no coincidence. For decades, cartel logistics had mirrored military supply chains. Now it seemed those chains were literally connected. The vault's contents were immediately classified. DHS sealed the site and handed over all evidence to a joint intelligence task force. Local police were ordered out. Journalists from Al Jazeera later reported that by dawn, the ranch had been surrounded by military trucks bearing no insignia. Their mission erased the scene. To the public, officials described it as a routine narcotic seizure, but internally, Washington panicked. Analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly drew chilling parallels between the vault and Cold War smuggling routes, once used to fund covert operations in Nicaragua and Angola. If those files are genuine, one expert warned they prove the line between organized crime and organized power disappeared long ago. The broader picture resembled the new era of hybrid warfare shaping global geopolitics. In Ukraine, intelligence networks and private contractors blur state boundaries. In the Middle East, Israel and Iran exchange strikes through third-party militias and cyber proxies. In Asia, China and the United States compete not just in markets, but in invisible data corridors, each embedding influence within supply chains. Now the same pattern had infected North America, the world's longest open border, quietly transforming into a digital battlefield. The human cost was immediate. In Laredo, families evacuated as federal teams dismantled what was left of the compound. Workers from nearby oil fields were questioned for weeks. Some vanished without explanation. Mexican truckers who had unknowingly ferried cartel cargo were blacklisted, their families threatened by rival groups seeking revenge for cooperating with the Americans. Meanwhile, rumors spread that El Mayo had survived the raid. Some claimed he had been extracted under secret protection. Others believed he had staged his own death to trigger the chaos that followed. A shadow broadcast later surfaced a distorted voice over a Mexican radio signal saying only "you cannot kill a shadow." The raid that began as a strike against narcotics had evolved into an existential crisis for both nations. The vault's discovery hinted that corruption was no longer a byproduct of crime, it was the architecture that sustained it. And if the threads led to defense contractors, intelligence agencies, and foreign trade networks, then what exactly was the Sinaloa cartel? A criminal empire or a mirror reflecting how power itself operates in the modern world? By the time the sun rose over Culiacan, Mexico was bleeding silence. Roads were blockaded with burning cars. News anchors whispered through trembling broadcasts. Soldiers vanished into ambushes that no one claimed responsibility for. The empire El Chapo built was now devouring itself. But amid the chaos, one rumor cut deeper than any bullet: El Mayo Zambada might still be alive. Days after the Laredo raid, a grainy video surfaced online. It showed an elderly man with El Mayo's gate boarding a private jet under U.S. escort near San Antonio. The clip disappeared within hours, but the message was unmistakable. The old king had traded loyalty for survival. Mexican intelligence sources quoted by Reuters described the footage as credible, while Al Jazeera reported that cartel insiders believed El Mayo had struck a deal to vanish in exchange for everything he knew. That single rumor ignited a firestorm. Across Mexico, factions within the Sinaloa cartel turned on one another. Mazatlan burned first, then Juarez, then Los Mochis. Each faction blamed another for the betrayal. Warehouse convoys belonging to El Mayo's logistics network were destroyed, and entire police precincts emptied overnight. DW described it as a self-consuming civil war, unlike anything seen since the fall of Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. For Washington, the optics were complex. President Donald Trump declared that the border war has entered a new era, pledging total cooperation with Mexico, even as Mexican officials privately accused the U.S. of instigating the chaos. The BBC reported that Mexican legislators demanded proof that the raid had not violated international sovereignty, while The Guardian noted that White House aides refused to comment on whether El Mayo was in U.S. custody. The strategic implications were enormous. The fall of Sinaloa shattered the fragile equilibrium that had kept rival cartels, especially the Jalisco New Generation Cartel CJNG, in check. Defense analysts from Janes confirmed that CJNG had seized key border routes within 72 hours of the raid, using US-made armored vehicles captured from Mexican military depots. The collapse of Sinaloa's hierarchy triggered a regional power vacuum, and in the chaos, weapons once meant for counter-narcotics forces began resurfacing in cartel arsenals. This kind of implosion wasn't unique to Mexico. In the Middle East, Israel and Iran's shadow war has spawned splinter factions fighting under false flags, each serving unseen sponsors. In Eastern Europe, Ukraine's front lines host a tangle of state and private networks, blurring accountability. In Asia, China's state-backed corporations operate digital fronts as powerful as armies. Each case reveals the same truth: power rarely dies, it multiplies in fragments. For civilians across northern Mexico, the Ghost War wasn't a metaphor. Families fled burning neighborhoods. Drones buzzed overhead, dropping grenades on convoys and safe houses alike. Reuters reported that thousands were displaced in Sinaloa and Sonora, creating the largest internal refugee wave in Mexico's modern history. To many, it no longer mattered who ruled cartel government or ghost. Then came the broadcast. On April 2nd, multiple radio frequencies across Mexico were hijacked. A voice distorted but unmistakably calm declared, "You cannot kill a shadow. I built the bridges you walk on." Intelligence traced the signal to the Sierra Madre Mountains, El Mayo's rumored refuge. Within hours, pro-Sinaloa accounts flooded social media with one chilling phrase: El Mayo vive. If that was true, then the Texas raid hadn't killed the architect. It had merely forced him underground to rebuild. And if El Mayo Zambada was still alive, what would a man who built empires from shadows do next? Disappear forever or start rewriting the rules of power all over again? As Mexico burned, Washington went silent. Behind closed doors, officials at the Department of Homeland Security and the DEA initiated a classified operation known only by one name, Operation Black Veil. Publicly, President Donald Trump called the Texas raid a decisive victory against organized terror. Privately, intelligence committees feared it had exposed the deepest infiltration of U.S. infrastructure since the Cold War. Leaked memos reviewed by Reuters revealed that Operation Black Veil's true purpose wasn't to hunt surviving cartel leaders, it was to trace how far their influence had spread inside American institutions. DHS analysts began cross-referencing the seized Texas data vault with procurement contracts, discovering financial pathways that led through defense subcontractors, shipping firms, and even municipal projects in Houston and Phoenix. The findings were explosive money traced to shell entities linked to the Sinaloa network had been funneled through legitimate U.S. supply chains for nearly a decade. The Guardian reported that these revelations sparked panic on Capitol Hill. A Senate subcommittee quietly convened under the title Northern Hemisphere Narco Infrastructure Breach. Its hearings were sealed, no transcripts released, but insiders described a grim realization cartel economics had merged with America's own bloodstream. This wasn't infiltration, one unnamed lawmaker told BBC News. It was assimilation. Further intelligence confirmed that multiple defense contractors named in the seized files had provided encrypted communications software used both by U.S. military units and cartel operatives. Jane's Defense Weekly drew parallels to the 1980s Iran-Contra scandal, where weapons sold under covert programs found their way into the hands of insurgents. Once again, the lines between warfighter and criminal blurred beyond recognition. As Operation Black Veil expanded, investigators began unearthing a new dimension: digital warfare. Analysts discovered that parts of the Sinaloa network were embedded within U.S. cyber infrastructure using proxy servers to mask trafficking revenue as legitimate crypto investments. The scheme resembled tactics used by Russian oligarchs during sanctions evasion and by Chinese syndicates operating through Hong Kong. America's own systems had become the battlefield. But Washington's silence carried a cost. Across Mexico, CJNG militants capitalized on the vacuum storming cities abandoned by Sinaloa. In Veracruz, convoys paraded with banners reading, "This is for the ghost." Meanwhile, in Laredo, Texas, federal agents began disappearing, 2 in April, 3 more in May. None were recovered. DW cited anonymous DHS sources suggesting these kidnappings were retaliations coordinated by rogue Sinaloa factions still enraged over the deaths of Ovidio and Ivan Guzman. The geopolitical echoes were undeniable. The United States now faced the same hybrid threat that haunts nations like Ukraine: invisible wars fought with data money and narrative manipulation. In the Middle East, the Israel-Iran conflict raged with drones and deniable strikes, while in Asia, China's shadow economy tested Washington's capacity to separate trade from espionage. The cartel war was no longer just about narcotics, it was a new front in the global contest for influence. For those on the ground, the cost was human and immediate. Laredo's border communities suffered blackouts after infrastructure hacks believed to be retaliation. Truckers refused to cross into Mexico. Children grew up under curfews, learning to distinguish the sound of helicopters from gunfire. Even journalists stopped naming sources, fearing the ghosts of Sinaloa more than their own governments. And still, one question kept haunting the intelligence halls of Washington. If El Mayo's network could burrow this deeply into America's systems, what other ghosts are already inside waiting for the next chaos to pull their strings? Summer arrived over the borderlands like a ghost wearing sunlight. The smoke had cleared, but the silence that followed was worse. Entire regions of northern Mexico had become ungovernable. The Sinaloa cartel, once an empire, was now a constellation of warring fragments. Yet beneath the ashes, something darker began to emerge, a network too organized to be chaos, too invisible to be coincidence. The world was realizing that the cartel hadn't died, it had evolved. Weeks after the last gunfire faded, Border Patrol agents discovered a burned SUV deep in West Texas. Inside were 3 bodies and a sealed envelope. The note inside was typed on aged paper, signed only with the initials MZ. It read, "There are no cartels, only shareholders." According to Reuters and The Guardian, the message was authenticated by U.S. intelligence. What it implied was terrifying: that El Mayo's empire had transcended drugs and violence, morphing into a decentralized financial machine operating through legitimate trade defense and digital markets. BBC News reported that encrypted transactions recovered from the Texas raid linked cartel funds to offshore holdings in Luxembourg, Singapore, and Panama, the same havens used by multinational corporations. In short, Sinaloa's shadow economy had merged with the global one. Meanwhile, DHS surveillance teams began intercepting digital chatter suggesting that El Mayo had not only survived but was directing operations remotely through proxy accounts. His rumored codename Spectre 1. By June, the DW Bureau in Berlin compared this new phenomenon to corporate insurgency, a term describing entities that operate simultaneously as businesses, militias, and intelligence fronts. The line separating power from profit no longer existed. Across the world, similar trends were unfolding. In Ukraine, private defense contractors now rival state armies. In Iran and Israel, AI-driven surveillance merges with military industry. In China, state-owned tech giants shape the battlefield of information. El Mayo had simply adapted that model for crime, a cartel that no longer trafficked drugs but data. His war wasn't over, it had just changed its name. The humanitarian toll was catastrophic. Al Jazeera reported that over 40,000 people were displaced from Sinaloa and Durango by mid-year. Electricity grids collapsed as saboteurs targeted energy lines owned by shell companies once tied to cartel logistics. Hospitals ran out of supplies. Entire villages vanished from census maps. In Culiacan, locals painted murals of a video and Ivan Guzman martyrs holding rifles and crosses while whispering prayers to El Mayo, the ghost who would return. In Washington, President Donald Trump authorized Operation Sentinel, a coordinated U.S.-Mexico stabilization mission aimed at restoring border integrity and dismantling economic infiltration. But analysts from Jane's Defense Weekly warned that targeting this new ghost empire would be nearly impossible. You can destroy men, one intelligence officer said, but you can't bomb algorithms, bank codes, or belief systems. That was the legacy El Mayo left behind, not a cartel, but a self-regenerating shadow economy spanning both hemispheres. And for the first time in modern history, America faced an adversary without a flag, an army, or a face. Now, as night falls over the desert, once again, the question remains. If the war on drugs has become a war on systems, one fought through finance, technology, and fear, can any nation truly claim victory, or have the ghosts of power already learned how to live among us? The fall of El Chapo's empire began with a single raid in Texas, a DHS strike that killed 2 of his sons and unearthed a hidden bunker linking the Sinaloa cartel to decades of covert operations and political corruption. The discovery exposed encrypted networks, weapons, contracts, and financial trails tying cartel money to American defense infrastructure. El Mayo Zambada, the invisible mastermind behind Sinaloa, vanished amid the chaos, sparking a civil war that turned Mexico into a battlefield of ghosts. As the conflict spread, Washington uncovered unsettling truths. Cartel capital had merged into legitimate markets, its power coded into data, logistics, and finance. Under President Donald Trump, new operations like Black Veil and Sentinel sought to contain the threat, but the enemy was no longer tangible. What began as a drug war had transformed into a digital, economic, and psychological conflict.